Most of you know that I have two daughters. Most of you probably don't know that I have a goddaughter as well. Her name's Leah. She's 35 now, which is hard for me to believe. This is my favorite memory of her. We were over at my friend's parents' house. It was a very nice house. And she was about 2 years old enough to talk, but still in diapers. And she was standing on what I'm assuming was a very expensive rug, which is important to the story, drinking, a glass of tea. But apparently her diaper was a little loose, because as she drank from this tea, her diaper spilled and she had tea going one end and pee coming out of the other end on this carpet. So she stopped and she looked down, and then she looked at me, and with all the confidence in the world, she said, "Daddy did it." Just as a matter of fact, in her 2-year-old mind, if she said it, then that was all the proof she needed. It's important to kids what they can prove, although it doesn't always come out that way. They often express it like this: "That's not fair." Then they make their case. We've heard a whole lot of what is fair and isn't fair at our house over the years. And of course, parents are much more interested in something more important than what is fair. They want quiet. But kids very quickly get to the age where they begin to understand that there are things that you can prove and there are things that you cannot prove. Now, I was very fortunate to grow up in a house where I could just come home and ask Dad, some theological question. And there's nothing that Dad enjoyed more than to talk through some type of question like that. So I would come home after having some kind of discussion with my friends and say something like, "Dad, how can you prove that there is a God?" And these would not be short conversations, but eventually he would say something like, "You cannot prove it, but there are many things in life that are beyond proof." Then he would say something like this: "Can you prove that your mother loves you?" And I would say, "Yes." And he would say, "Okay, well, how?" And the conversation would sound something like this: "Yes, I can prove it because she takes care of me." And he would say, "Well, does every mother who takes care of her child also love her child?" "Well, no, but she tells me that she loves me." "Okay, does every mother who speaks those words actually still love her child?" "Well, not necessarily." So this would go on for a while, and then he would say, "How do you know your mother loves you?" "Because deep down in your heart, you know that you have experienced her love. It is beyond proof. It is experienced. You can't experience it for someone else by proof. But it does not take away from the meaning of what you have experienced." How important is that for you? All of us, from time to time, get confronted in one way or another by people who believe differently. And often, if it is a discussion about Christianity, the conversation will begin with the creation story. They will say it cannot be proved because there's scientific proof that proves that is not how the earth came into being. How is an important question. It has to do with proof. And before I go any farther, I don't want anybody here to hear me say anything about denying science. I never thought I would have to say that, but we live in crazy times. What I am saying is that there are questions other than how, and they are important. And in my mind, they are deeper, and they are reflective of humankind's search for meaning in their lives. Different questions. I do not mean that the how questions are not important. They are. Let's not minimize those, but let's consider the importance of questions like these. Who and why? Who am I? Why am I here? Who is God? Why did he decide to make the world, make us? If you really want to ask the most basic question of all, it sounds like this: why something and not nothing? Why did God choose to create in the first place? Why something and not nothing? This creation story that we read this morning is just so beautifully written, the imagery of the Spirit of God sweeping over the formless void, and from the nothingness came chaos, and from the chaos, beauty. And by what method did God choose to make this happen? By speaking it into being. And what was first? Let there be light. That theme runs through the Bible from beginning to end. Let there be light in a dark world. These beautiful words and themes are beyond proof and offer us something deeper than scientific explanations. We believe creation happened. We believe there was a downfall of humankind. We believe that there was a great flood. But the explanations for them are not about how. They are explanations about the human condition. They answer deep questions about who we are, about who God is. This does not limit our understanding, it deepens it. It's not about the nature of creation, it is about the nature of the Creator. Two very different things. The writer of Genesis wanted to make known that it was experienced this way. In the seminary, or my seminary at least, when you begin to study the Old Testament, you're introduced to an ancient story called the Enuma Elish. It's a story that traces its roots to the same time when the creation story was first put on paper. And there are a lot of similarities, but they are not identical. The Enuma Elish describes the Babylonian god Marmaduke. Not Marmaduke. Marduk. Marmaduke, different story. The Babylonian god Marduk goes to battle with this sea creature called Tiamat, and he wins the battle and creates the earth out of the carcass of this animal that he defeated. And what you see here is this dualism between good and evil. There are many similarities, but here is the critical difference. In these other creation stories that you can study if you wish, there is this idea of good and evil and them either being equal or almost equal. But the creation story in the Bible, the writer of Genesis makes it clear they're not even close to equal. God is all powerful and all love. In the beginning was only God, and in the end, God will have the last word. Now, clearly, evil is introduced into the story, and we do not want to minimize the role that evil plays. And Lord knows we feel like we're seeing it more these days than we have in our lifetime. We don't minimize evil whatsoever. But we do believe that in the end, God will have the last word. And that all the evil from human beings, not just now, but all throughout time, will be totally overcome by the love of God and the grace of God. I love the way Madeleine L'Engle said it. She said, all the wickedness in all the world that man might work or think is no more to the grace of God than a hot coal being dropped into the sea. I love that imagery. This idea of the sin that we experience in the world that can be so hurtful, like a hot coal that would burn right through our hand, is no more to the love of God or the grace of God than a hot coal being dropped in the sea. What we see in the creation story is the world being divided in two ways, the uncreated and the created. On the uncreated side, there is only one thing, God. On the created side is everything else we ever experience in life. And how we relate to each of these is critical to how we live our lives. And how we relate to each other, how we relate to things like money or power. All of that is to be put on the created side, because we as Christians are only to worship that which is uncreated, God. We are to reserve worship for God only. And we make our decisions based on putting God first. We are to relate to the uncreated, to God, in a certain way through worship. Everything else is to be related to differently. But where we fail is when we allow something in our lives to cross that line. God makes it clear from the very beginning we are not to worship anything or anybody else because it will wreck our lives. We worship only God. We put God first for many reasons, but one is that it gives us perspective in life. The writer of Genesis uses the imagery of light in the darkness, light in a dark world. It cheapens the story to argue about it from a scientific point of view. Imagine how long ago it was written, and imagine the kinds of religions that existed at that time, many of which worshiped the sun. So what might the writer of Genesis be saying by introducing the light first? Not only is the sun not God, but the sun is a servant to the Creator. Can you imagine how that would have been received? What would be the reaction of people who worshiped the sun? All the power and purpose that this Creator has, and yet still He is personal. He seeks out a relationship with us. How would those who believe that the gods were up there somewhere distant and apathetic at best and maybe even hostile to humans, how would they have heard the Genesis story for the first time? That God not only creates but seeks out to us because of His love for us. And ultimately, as the Bible unfolds, that God loved us so much that He decided to become one of us to bring light to a dark world. The same God who was so powerful to speak nothingness into beauty wanted also to be personal. This is the kind of Creator that would also be a Redeemer. We prepare with what we find in creation to meet God personally. Can you prove that your mother loves you? Can you prove that you have had an encounter with the living Christ? Is it logic or proof that leads you to such an encounter? Or is it something deep within you that craves a relationship with the Creator of all things? In this New Testament passage that we read, this is the light coming into the world. All of the darkness, all of the evil is separated by this beautiful light. First, God spoke the Word, and now the Word has been made flesh. The Word, the light, made personal. And the first thing the writer does, after he describes it this way, is to say that there was a man who came to testify to this light. John the Baptist is introduced to speak the truth to this light. How critical is that for our journey as Christians? As Christians, we believe that we too have had this experience. There's no proof to this experience. No one could sit down with me in my office and somehow use logic or reasoning to convince me that I did not experience what I did when I was 9 years old in that chapel, when I was in my teens in our youth group, when I was teaching Sunday school to little ones, when I was called to drop everything I was doing to go into ministry. And even in those day-to-day moments that you can never expect, like when I was leaving the hospital one day and this woman who did not speak English asked for me to pray for her. And I held her hand and prayed, recognizing she could not understand my words, but that we felt the Spirit of God between us. It was such a powerful moment for me. Carl Jung said that people often do not experience God because they don't look low enough. I can testify to you in the same manner of John the Baptist. There is a light in this dark world, and it can change everything about how you experience it. If you've grown up in Baptist life, then hopefully you've heard someone's story. Hopefully you shared your story. The Bible teaches us how powerful your story can be. Years ago, when I was in college, I got invited to go to a church up in La Follette with this girl from Carson Newman whose daddy was the preacher. And she kept warning me about his preaching. Now, it's not going to be like your dad. So I said, honey, don't worry about it. I just kept saying, don't worry about it. But it was not his preaching that I remembered most. The only other person I knew in that little church was my friend's friend, this girl that she had grown up with. Her name was Whitney, and she was very proper and mild, or at least that was my impression, until the preacher didn't ask for her testimony, but he did say, Whitney, do you have a song on your heart this morning? And this girl who seemed so mild to me said, well, I really didn't feel like singing this morning, but I guess Jesus didn't feel like hanging on that cross either, so I better get up and sing something. And she got up there with no accompaniment and just, whoa! I mean, just tore it up. It was just great hearing this, what I thought was this mild-mannered girl belt out this song. So I might just call on somebody this morning. Maybe next week. If you have had an encounter with the risen Christ, when you read this New Testament passage, you should put your own name in it. There was a man sent from God whose name was Drew. He came as a witness to testify to God's light in the world so that all might believe. Drew was not the light, but he experienced it, and it changed everything. That is an incredible responsibility that we have as Christians. We have experienced the light of the Creator. We have experienced the light of the living Christ. And it is an ongoing relationship, one that should have an impact on every other relationship. In the past 3 weeks, all of this evil stuff happening in Ukraine has overshadowed something that has been happening here that I want to talk about this morning. In the past 3 weeks, the CDC has revised their guidelines for wearing masks indoors. In the past 3 weeks, a 7-year-old little girl over at Rocky Hill Elementary School died from COVID. And in the last 3 weeks, Pfizer yanked their vaccine for littles from being considered. And now all these parents of littles have to wait again. Again. This morning, I want to close by sharing a post I read. One of my seminary buddies put it on his page. It was written by a girl named Lauren Graber, and the title is "The Parents Who Used to Come to Your Church Are Not Okay." And it speaks to the pain these parents of littles feel because they still cannot vaccinate their child. She says they're not okay. In fact, they are languishing. These are my words. Every time they see a light at the end of the tunnel for their family, the tunnel just gets longer and longer, again and again. She says, parents with little ones who can't yet be vaccinated continue to worry and juggle disruptions to their child care situations, which means disruptions to their work, their ability to make plans, to keep commitments, to take care of themselves, and every once in a while, they might be able to take care of themselves. They're languishing. Conversations with them are punctuated by shared sighs, shaking of heads, and they are not going back to church. When life is a series of weighted risk and catching COVID can mean so much more than just the virus itself, then the question becomes, is this gathering worth one of us getting sick or having to cancel plans or a week of quarantine? She says the few times we've been back to Sunday worship, the patterns of behavior were pretty much the same as they had been before the pandemic. Look nice, act nice, share snippets of nice conversations before and after the service. When I spend time with other parents, we're largely incapable of any of those things anymore, much less all of them at the same time. Yet, as positivity rates once again drop in my community and we don't rush back to church, I suspect the deeper motivation for keeping our family home every Sunday is something harder to talk about than health metrics. The experience of a global pandemic that has killed some 6 million people has added a question mark to many of my belief statements, not the ones about God, whom I continue to trust as the source of love and light, but absolutely about God's people. The last 2 years have broken my faith in humanity as I have watched Christians locally and nationally fervently argue that their personal rights trump the common good and the health of my child. When we see our kids back to in-person school with masks on their faces and told them that they wore them not only to protect themselves, but out of a love for the people around them, like Jesus taught, I've not been able to explain to my children why their good Christian neighbors were unwilling to pick up this particular cross for the sake of others. My fury, confusion, and lament about people's behavior feels impossible to separate from the churches in which they gather, and on most Sundays, it's just been easier to stay home. We need a church that will hear how fear has become part of our lives like never before, even though we are the generation that came of age with 9/11 and the financial collapse in 2008 and the killing of children like ours at Sandy Hook. We need a church that will listen without judgment to our complicated feelings about worship, creeds, prayer, and the other folks in the pews. Those words just broke my heart. So I want to speak directly to these young parents out there. I am so sorry that you are still going through this. I see you. I hear you. I know when my girls got vaccinated, it was like the weight of the world off my shoulders. But I'm so grateful that you have the option of continuing to worship with us online. I so wish for you to finally reach that light at the end of this long, dark tunnel. And please reach out to us. We want to help divide your burden. One time I was asked, what is your definition of ministry? And without thinking about it, what came out was this. I said, I believe in holding one hand out to God and the other to those that He would place in your path. I want to end today with this message to everyone in person and those of you at home. God began this journey with us by speaking and inviting us into holy conversation. So we experience Christian faith not as a transaction, but by a conversation. Not just when times are good, but when life hurts. Maybe even more so then. The light of the Creator was first. Transforming chaos into beauty was second. An invitation to a meaningful relationship was the goal all along. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not overcome it. God will have the last word. Amen. We've given many invitations in our church family over the years. And in the last months, we decided maybe we just need to give an invitation to kindness each week. So our invitation to kindness this week is to invite you to come to our Ash Wednesday service this Wednesday. It is always one of the most meaningful worship services for me because I do nothing but sit in the pews and worship. Naomi and Adam always do a fantastic job. And as you think about what you're going to do to prepare for our holiest day of Easter, consider giving up something other than some kind of food. Consider giving up something like resentment or the inability to forgive someone. Be invited into the kindness of this world. Our hymn is number 596, I Surrender All. We're going to sing verses 1, 3, and 4. What a perfect hymn to sing at a time like this. Will you stand? Will you sing? Will you respond?